The moment Aurelian Belisar crossed the threshold of the Midnight Crescent diner, every fluorescent light in the building flickered, stuttered, and then blazed back with a cold, unnatural intensity that made the linoleum floors look like pale ice. Sienna Castell felt it before she saw him, a pressure at the base of her skull, like the drop before a storm, like the breath a city holds before lightning tears the sky open. She had been refilling Table 7's coffee, and the ceramic pot trembled in her grip without her meaning it to. He walked in wearing a coat the color of black smoke, 6 feet and 4 inches of absolute stillness contained inside a moving form. His hair was white, the kind of white that had never once been any other color, swept back from a face carved from marble and tragedy. His eyes were the pale silver of a coin that had been buried underground for 1,000 years. Every conversation in the diner died within 3 seconds of his arrival. Not because people saw something wrong, but because every animal instinct written into human DNA by 1,000,000 years of evolutions screamed, softly and clearly, that something ancient and dominant had entered the room. He looked directly at Sienna. Not at the menu board, not at the row of booths, not at the flickering neon sign above the counter that read open 24 hours. He looked at her with an expression so controlled it was terrifying, and he said nothing. And he walked to the counter and sat down on one of the red vinyl stools like he owned not just the diner but every atom of air inside it. Sienna put the pot down before she dropped it. She smoothed her apron. She had survived 3 years of working the night shift alone, a neighborhood that had slowly gone strange over the past 18 months, and a landlord who thought her heat was optional in February. She was not going to let a pale man with a dramatic coat rattle her in her own workplace. She walked to the counter. "What can I get you?" she asked. He folded his hands on the countertop. His fingers were long, ringed at the index and middle of his left hand with silver bands that bore engravings so fine they looked like text. He did not pick up a menu. He looked at her the way a judge looks at a case file and said quietly, "Your name is Sienna Castell." It was not a question. Her chin came up. "If you already know my name, you don't need a menu. What do you actually want?" Something moved behind his silver eyes. Faint, almost imperceptible. Not warmth, not yet. Something closer to surprise. He had not expected that. Whatever briefing he had received about her had clearly not included the information that she did not flinch. "My name," he said, "is Aurelian Belisar. I am the sovereign king of the Veleth Court, and I have come here under the blood law of condemnation passage, which grants any ruling vampire lord the right to stand before any individual believed to have committed a crime against the immortal order and render judgment on sight." The diner was so quiet that the hum of the refrigerator behind the pie case sounded like a scream. Sienna placed both hands flat on the counter, leaned forward slightly, and met his gaze without blinking. "Okay," she said. "What crime am I supposedly accused of?" The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, it was the shadow of one. "You are accused of sheltering Mira Voss, a rogue blood witch who fled the Veleth Court 7 months ago after stealing the cipher seal, a binding artifact capable of dissolving any ancient vow made between vampire courts. She is believed to have taken refuge here, in your place of residence. The blood law states that any human who knowingly harbors a fugitive of the immortal order becomes complicit in the fugitive's crime and subject to the same sentence, and the sentence for Mira Voss." Sienna said carefully, "Is what exactly?" "Permanent dissolution," he said. "In simplest terms, execution." The fluorescent light above them buzzed once and steadied. Sienna pulled her hands from the counter and straightened up fully. She was 5 feet and 6 inches of brown-haired, dark-eyed determination in a blue apron. And she looked at the Vampire King of the Veleth Court and said, "Then you need to hear what I actually know before you render anything. Because I think someone sent you here with bad information and you're too intelligent to act on a lie." He stared at her for a long-drawn moment. Then he said, "Tell me." She had not actually expected him to say that. She took a slow breath and said, "Not here, in the back. I'm not having this conversation where the couple at table 3 can record it on their phones." He stood. He moved around the counter as though she had already given him permission, which she supposed she had. Sienna led him through the swinging door into the kitchen, past the startled cook named Pete, who dropped an entire spatula at the sight of Aurelian and said, "Whoa." and she walked into the small storage room at the back where the extra napkin stock lived and shut the door behind them both. The room was narrow. He was very large. She stood her ground. Mira Voss did come to me, Sienna said. About 5 months ago. She was injured, she was terrified, and she told me she had done something she deeply regretted and that people were hunting her. She stayed in my apartment for 11 days. I did not know she was a blood witch. I thought she was a person in trouble, which is the only information I had to act on. Ignorance of the immortal order is not a recognized defense under blood law, he said. I know. That's not my defense. She crossed her arms. My defense is that Mira Voss did not steal your cipher seal. She told me who did, she had proof, and the reason she was running from your court is because the person who actually stole it is inside your court, and they framed her to cover it up. Silence. Aurelian Belisar looked at her for a very long time. His expression did not change dramatically, but something behind it reorganized itself, like furniture being moved in a darkened room. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, lower, more careful. Where is Mira Voss now? Safe, Sienna said. I know where she is, I will tell you, and I will give you what she left with me, which includes documentation of what she found, but only under one condition. You are not in a position to negotiate conditions with the blood law, Miss Castell. I'm not negotiating with the blood law, she said. I'm negotiating with you. And you're still standing here, which means you're at least considering it, which means you're not the kind of king who executes first and learns afterward, so hear me out. Another long pause, then very deliberately, he said, Speak. My condition is that Mira gets a real hearing, in front of your full court, with the evidence she collected presented openly. If she's guilty after that, I won't stand in the way of whatever your law says, but if she's innocent, and I believe she is, then the real thief answers for it instead. That's it. That's all I'm asking. He studied her face as though reading text, written in a language he had not encountered in centuries. She noticed, distantly, that his eyes were not just silver. There were filaments of pale blue threaded through the silver, visible only when the storage room's single bare bulb caught them at the right angle. They were extraordinary eyes. This was not the time to be noticing that. You, he said slowly, are either profoundly brave or profoundly foolish. The two aren't mutually exclusive, she said. Do we have an agreement? He extended one long hand palm up between them. On his palm, a thin line of light appeared, silvery and cold, like a thread of moonlight made solid. In my court, he said, agreements between a sovereign and a civilian are bound by spoken vow and witnessed light. This is how I offer you assurance that your condition will be honored. You speak the terms, I confirm them, the light seals it. It cannot be broken without consequence to me. Sienna looked at the light in his palm. Then she looked at his face. And you're offering this voluntarily. I do not make offers I do not intend to keep, Miss Castell. It is the oldest rule of my house. She reached out and touched the edge of the light with 2 fingers. It was cold and it hummed faintly, like a string that had just been plucked. Mira Voss receives a full hearing in the Veleth Court, with all evidence presented openly, and no harm comes to her before, during, or as a result of that hearing, unless she is found guilty by the majority of the court's ruling council. Confirmed, he said. The light sealed with a sound like a single, clean bell note, and then it vanished, Sienna exhaled. Okay, give me 15 minutes to get someone to cover my shift. He blinked. You intend to come with me? The evidence Mira left is in my apartment, and, frankly, given the kind of people who framed an innocent woman to cover their theft, I'm not handing anything over until I'm standing in front of your whole court, where it's harder to make things disappear quietly. She untied her apron. Also, I want to make sure Mira gets there safely. I promised her she could trust me. Something crossed his face then. Something she would spend a long time later trying to name. It was not admiration exactly. It was the expression of a creature who had lived so long that genuine surprise had become almost impossible, and who had just been genuinely surprised. You promised a blood witch you would protect her, he said. I promised a scared woman I would help her. I didn't know about the blood witch part until later, and it didn't seem like a good reason to change my answer. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said very quietly, No, I suppose it would not. The city outside the Midnight Crescent Diner was wrapped in the particular darkness that only existed between 2 and 4 in the morning. That abandoned hour where even the streetlights seemed to be merely going through the motions. Aurelian's car was parked directly in front, illegally and imperiously, a long black vehicle that looked like it had been designed in an era that had not quite arrived yet. He opened the passenger door for her without being asked. She noticed. 2 other vampires were waiting on the sidewalk. They were both tall, white-haired, with the same marble-pale complexion as Aurelian, dressed in darker colors than the city around them. They looked at Sienna with expressions ranging from carefully neutral to quietly alarmed. "Casimir," Aurelian said to the one on the left, who had deep-set eyes the color of antique pewter. "We are making a stop before going to the court. The human is under my personal protection as of this moment. Treat her accordingly." Casimir absorbed this with the practiced stillness of someone who had long ago accepted that his king operated on a different frequency than the rest of the world. "Understood, my lord." The one on the right, younger seeming, with wide ice-blue eyes and an expression that could not quite mask its own curiosity, looked at Sienna and said, "You're the waitress." "Lauders," Aurelian said, without emphasis. And Leodis immediately straightened and said nothing further. Sienna's apartment was 12 blocks away, on the 4th floor of a building that had once been a textile factory, and had the industrial bones to prove it. All exposed brick and iron radiators, and windows so large they made the rooms feel like they were trying to become the outside world. She let herself in with her key, Aurelian filling the doorway behind her with a presence she could feel against the back of her neck like warmth from an open fire. "I know vampires need to be invited in," she said without turning around. "So, come in." She heard him cross the threshold. The air in the apartment shifted with his presence. The evidence Mira had left was in a fireproof document box under Sienna's bed. Because Sienna had learned a long time ago that the things worth keeping were worth protecting. She pulled it out, unlocked it with a key she kept on her actual person, and opened it on the kitchen table under the overhead light. Aurelian sat across from her, and for the first time she saw him genuinely focus on something that was not her. He went through the documents methodically, his expression growing incrementally more still with each page, which she was beginning to understand was how he registered emotion he was not ready to express. The photographs, the transcribed conversations, the blood-signed record written in Mira's own hand of what she had witnessed inside the Veleth Court 7 months ago. "Valdros," he said. The name came out very quiet and very cold. "Who is Valdros?" Sienna asked. "My second advisor. A member of the ruling council for 140 years. He set the final document down with perfect care. A man I trusted." The silence between them then was a different kind than before. Not the silence of a confrontation. The silence of something breaking open. "I am sorry," Sienna said, and she meant it. He looked up at her. The pale blue filaments in his silver eyes were more visible now, and the careful, regal mask he wore had developed the finest of fractures. "You have nothing to apologize for." "No," she agreed, "but you clearly trusted him, and finding out someone you trusted did something like this is its own kind of loss, regardless of how powerful you are." He looked at her for a moment as though she had said something in a language he recognized from a very long time ago, something he had not expected to hear again. Then he gathered the documents into an even, precise stack and said, "We need to leave. The court convenes in 3 hours, and I want this presented before anyone has time to warn Valdros." They drove south through the city in near silence, the streets emptying around them as the car moved with an ease that suggested traffic signals were making certain accommodations they would not make for anyone else. Sienna sat in the back beside Aurelian, the document box on the seat between them, and she watched the city lights streak past the window and thought about how spectacularly her Tuesday had departed from its expected trajectory. "How did you come to make a promise to someone you had just met?" Aurelian asked. His voice was quiet, without judgment. Almost curious, Sienna considered the question honestly. "Mira knocked on my door at 2 in the morning, bleeding from a cut above her eye, and asked if she could use my phone. I could have sent her to the lobby, or called her a cab, or done a dozen sensible things that kept her at a distance. But she looked at me like she had not encountered a single person who had not been a threat to her in weeks, and I thought, okay, one night. One night isn't complicated." She paused. "It became 11 days, which is admittedly more complicated, but the principle is the same. You act decently toward people who need it, and you sort out the rest as it comes. That is a remarkably simple philosophy, he said. Simple isn't the same as wrong. He made a sound that was low and brief and almost warm. No, he said, it is not. The Veleth Court was not, as Sienna might have vaguely imagined, a remote Gothic castle brooding on a hilltop somewhere. It was beneath the city, accessed through a private building in the financial district that presented itself to the world as a law firm. The elevator that took them down did not show which floor they were descending to. It descended for longer than any above-ground building would have permitted. When the doors opened, Sienna stepped into a world that felt like the 21st century had been gently laid over the bones of the 14th. The architecture was stone, cathedral vaulted, lit with fixtures that mimicked candlelight but were electric in their precision. Tapestries hung on the walls with images Sienna could not quite pass, intricate and old, depicting histories she had no frame of reference for. The floors were polished black marble. Guards stood at intervals, all white-haired, all armed, all watching her arrival, with expressions that communicated they had very specific opinions about it. Aurelian walked through the court with the absolute authority of someone for whom every room he entered became his room. People parted around him. Those who caught sight of Sienna at his side had the kind of reactions that ranged from control surprise to poorly masked outrage. "She is human," someone said, not quietly enough. "She is under my protection," Aurelian said. Without looking for the speaker, his voice carrying effortlessly through the stone corridors. "The next person who implies that constitutes a problem will explain their objection to me directly." Silence followed, the kind that agreed. He put her in a room to one side of the main court chamber, a smaller room with a long table and chairs that probably cost more than Sienna's car, and told her he needed to speak to Casimir and two others privately before the court convened. He looked at her before he left, his hand lifted briefly, almost involuntarily, as though he intended to touch her shoulder or her face or some reassuring point of contact, and then he stopped himself. His hand returned to his side. He said, "You will not be alone in this room. Leodas will remain with you." "I don't need a guard," she said. "I know," he said. "He is not there to guard you from the room. He is there to ensure nothing from outside the room becomes a problem for you." She understood the distinction. "Thank you." Something in his expression did what she was beginning to recognize as his version of softening. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a sound like a carefully kept promise. Leodas settled into a chair near the door with the comfortable ease of someone who spent a lot of time stationed in doorways. He was younger than the others, she thought, or at least younger seeming. He looked at her with that barely contained curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure. Were you afraid when the king walked into your diner and said the blood law thing?" Sienna thought about it genuinely. "I was startled, but afraid is different. Afraid would have made me do something stupid, like lie, or run, or just hand over the documents without making sure Mira would be safe first." Leodas tilted his head. "Most humans, when they encounter a ruling lord for the first time, do not argue conditions with them." I noticed he didn't seem to hold it against me. "He didn't," Leodas said, and something in his tone suggested this was remarkable. "Is he usually harder to reason with?" Leodas considered this carefully. "He is always reasonable. He is one of the most genuinely reasonable rulers the court has had in centuries, but he is also the Veleth king, which means most people do not actually attempt to reason with him. They either comply or they challenge him, and challenging him ends badly. What you did was different. You offered him information and logic and a clear path to the truth." He paused. He was not expecting that. He is not used to it. "He should be," she said. "Logic is useful." "Yes," Leodas agreed, with the faint wonder of someone filing away a thought for later. "It is." The court chamber was enormous, the ceiling vaulting upward into darkness beyond the reach of the candle-like lights, the walls lined with the seating of the ruling council, 23 members in graduated tiers, all vampire, all ancient, all watching with expressions shaped by centuries of careful opacity. Sienna sat in a seat Aurelian had placed specifically, close to the main floor where evidence would be presented, not tucked away in a corner, not hidden, visible, deliberate. She was here as a witness, and he intended for everyone to know it. Valdros, she identified within the first few minutes, was a vampire who looked, superficially, like a grandfather, white-haired as they all were, but with a quality of careful warmth about his face that she immediately distrusted. He was the kind of person who had learned to perform benevolence so well it had become indistinguishable from his face. He sat in the second tier, third from the left, and he had been watching Sienna since she entered with an expression she could only describe as calculating. Aurelian took the central floor. He stood with the document box before him and spoke in a voice that required no amplification. He told the court what had been brought to him. He presented each document individually, naming sources, explaining provenance, citing Mira Voss's testimony and the evidence she had collected. The court was silent throughout. Not the silence of disinterest, but the silence of a held breath. When Aurelian named Valdros, the silence fractured, not into chaos but into the particular sharp quality of a room, recalibrating its certainties. Valdros rose from his seat. He was very good. His expression was wounded, not guilty. He spread his hands in a gesture of hurt openness. "My king," he said, "I am grieved to see my name attached to this accusation. This human woman, this waitress. She sheltered a fugitive who fed her a fabricated story. Who knows what Mira Voss told her, or what she was paid to say?" "I wasn't paid anything," Sienna said from her seat. Several heads turned. In this room, this court, a human speaking without being addressed was not a neutral act. She continued before anyone could stop her. "Mira Voss came to me with nothing. She had been running for weeks. She was injured, and she was terrified. People who are lying to build a convenient narrative don't usually arrive bleeding and asking to use someone else's phone. They show up with a polished story and no inconvenient details. Mira had nothing but inconvenient details, and she shared all of them. She speaks out of turn," someone said from the upper tier. "She speaks with the floor, as I have granted her," Aurelian said. His voice was absolute. "Continue, Miss Castell." She met Valdros's eyes across the chamber. "There is one document in that box I would like the council to look at specifically. It is a blood-signed record. In your court's own tradition, a blood-signed record cannot be falsified. The signature is tied to the signatory's actual blood, and its authenticity can be verified. Mira signed it. If you verify the signature, and it matches Mira Voss's blood, then the account she gave is her genuine account, witnessed and sworn. That's your tradition, not mine. But it means the question of whether she fabricated her account has an answer that doesn't require anyone to take my word for it." The chamber was completely still. Aurelian lifted the blood-signed record from the box. He extended it toward the senior council member, a woman of extraordinary presence with white hair gathered in an architectural arrangement and eyes like pale amber glass, who Sienna had heard addressed as Countess Valara. The countess took the document. She opened a silver case at her side. She drew a single slender instrument from it and touched it to the record's signature line. The light that came off it was red gold. Clear, steady. It did not flicker or dim or shift. Countess Valara looked at the king. "Genuine," she said. "The blood signature belongs to Mira Voss. The account is sworn." 3 things happened very quickly. Valdros moved or tried to move in the direction of the chamber door. Casimir and another guard were already there. Valdros turned to the court instead, his careful warmth now stripped away, something older and colder and much more honest beneath it. He said, "The cipher seal is more important than any of you understand. It needed to be controlled. She would have given it to the wrong hands entirely. I did what was necessary. You stole a binding artifact from my court," Aurelian said. He crossed the chamber floor toward Valdros in 7 deliberate steps, each one landing with a finality that the stone itself seemed to register. "You framed an innocent blood witch. You sent hunters after her. You came to me with false testimony, and you used my judgment as a weapon against a woman who had done nothing but discover your crime. And you stood in this chamber for 140 years, in a seat I gave you, as an advisor I trusted, and you call what you did necessary." He stopped 2 feet from Valdros. "You will stand trial under the full blood law," Aurelian said. "Every charge will be laid before this council, every shred of evidence examined. This court does not execute without hearing, even yours." He held Valdros's gaze and did not look away. "The difference between you and me, Valdros, is that I still believe the process matters." Valdros was taken by Casimir and 2 guards to a holding level below the court. The chamber reordered itself. Voices rose in controlled, serious discussion. Countess Velara called for an immediate adjournment of standard session to convene a trial council within 48 hours. Aurelian came to Sienna. He stopped in front of her chair and looked down at her. She looked up at him. The fractures in his mask were wider now. Not broken, not collapsing, but genuinely open in a way she suspected few people in this court had ever been permitted to see. "The blood-signed record," he said. "You knew about that. Mira told me about it. She told me everything about your court's traditions, because she wanted me to understand what it would mean, if I ever ended up needing to explain what she'd left with me. She prepared me, in case she was caught before she could speak for herself. She trusted you with that. She trusted me with all of it, and I promised her I would use it correctly if it came to that." Sienna stood from the chair. They were close, in the reorganized space of the chamber, close enough that she had to look up at him at a sharper angle. "Where is Mira now? We need to bring her in safely so she can testify for the trial." "I have already sent Leodas," he said. "He will bring her in with a full protective escort. She will not be touched before the trial or after, not unless this council renders a different verdict than the evidence warrants." He paused. "Which I will not permit." "Thank you," she said. "You reversed my judgment," he said. "It was not quite an accusation, it was something more like wonder. I arrived prepared to render a sentence on a crime I believed was clear, and you reversed it. In a storage room, in a diner. At 2 in the morning. I reversed it because it was wrong," she said simply. "And you were willing to listen, which says more about you than it does about me." The pale blue threads in his silver eyes were very visible now. He looked at her for a long moment, in which a great many things seemed to be happening behind his careful, ancient face. "You are an extraordinary woman, Sienna Castell," he said quietly. She felt something warm move through her chest at the way he said her name, full and deliberate, as though the syllables deserved the space he gave them. She was not naive enough to call it nothing. "I'm a waitress who got mixed up in vampire politics," she said, keeping her voice level. "It remains to be seen whether extraordinary is the right word." "It does not remain to be seen from where I am standing," he said. They looked at each other for a moment that stretched past comfortable and into something else, something neither of them quite named, and then a member of the council approached with a question for the king, and the moment released them both. Mira Voss arrived at the Veleth Court at dawn, which Sienna only knew about, because the deep underground court had no windows, and therefore no dawn to speak of, but the timestamp on Casimir's message to Aurelian said 5:47 in the morning. She was brought in looking exhausted and still carrying the particular tension of someone who had been afraid for a very long time, and when she saw Sienna, she crossed the waiting room in 3 steps and held her for a moment with a grip that said more than she could have articulated. "You actually came," Mira said. She was small and dark-eyed, with an otherworldly quality that Sienna could now identify as what she was, the barely leashed hum of blood magic, contained and complicated. "I told you I would," Sienna said. Mira pulled back and looked at her. "You argued the king of the Veleth Court into giving you conditions. He's reasonable when you treat him like he is." Myra looked at her with an expression compounded of relief and something else, something very near awe. "Sienna, he is 412 years old. Age doesn't make you immune to a good argument." Mira laughed for the first time in what sounded like months. The trial of Valdro took 2 full days. Sienna was called to testify on the 2nd morning. Seated before the full council and asked to account for her role in sheltering Mira, her discovery of the evidence, and her decision to contact the king's court. She spoke clearly and honestly, without performance, without the particular kind of strategic vulnerability that people used when they wanted to seem sympathetic rather than simply be truthful. She accounted for everything. The council asked their questions. Countess Velara, whose questioning was the and the most intellectually exacting, told her at the end that she had given the clearest human testimony this court had heard in her memory. Sienna thanked her and meant it. Aurelian was present for all of it, seated at the head of the chamber floor, presiding. He watched her testify with an attention that was not the attention of a sovereign monitoring a civilian. It was the attention of someone who found what they were watching genuinely compelling. who kept looking not because they needed to, but because they did not want to stop. Sienna noticed. She did not address it during the proceedings. There was a time and a place for everything. Valdros was found guilty of theft, conspiracy, and the fraudulent misuse of a blood law proceeding. The council's verdict, delivered by Countess Velara, in a voice like sentence structure given form, stripped him of his council seat, his court rank, his personal bloodline standing within the Veleth Court, and confined him to a monitored holding arrangement for a period the council would review in 50 years. His political influence within the court was over. It was, in the world of vampire political consequence, enormously severe. Myra Voss was formally cleared. The cipher seal, retrieved from where Valdros had concealed it, was returned to the court vault. Myra was offered reinstatement of her status and a formal apology, written into the court's official record, which was itself an unprecedented act that caused a distinct ripple of reaction throughout the council chamber. When the court adjourned and the proceedings were formally closed, Sienna sat in the chair she had occupied for 2 days and felt the particular hollow quality that followed extreme sustained tension. Like all the wires that had been pulled taut had simultaneously been released, and she needed a moment to remember what her shoulders were for. Aurelian sat beside her, not across from her, not at a ceremonial remove. He simply sat down in the adjacent chair, close enough that she was aware of the particular temperature he gave off, which was cooler than human warmth but not cold. Something adjacent to the feeling of marble that had been in a room all day. She found it absurdly steadying. "It is done," he said. "It is," she agreed. "You are exhausted." "I'm fine. You have been managing an extraordinary level of pressure for 2 days without expressing any of it," he said, with careful precision. "That does not constitute being fine. That constitutes being very good at not showing that you are not fine." She turned to look at him. "Are you diagnosing me?" "I am observing you," he said. "I have been doing very little else for 2 days." There it was, out in the open between them, without ceremony. She held his gaze. "I noticed. Did it bother you?" "No," she said honestly. "Which is its own kind of interesting." "Yes," he said. "It is." They were quiet for a moment. The chamber around them was emptying, voices and footsteps receding, leaving the enormous vaulted space with a cathedral quality, all stone and silence and the soft persistence of candlelight. "What happens now?" she asked. "For Myra, specifically she has chosen to leave the court permanently and establish herself independently. I have authorized it and provided her with the relevant clearances. She will be safe. The court is bound by the verdict to leave her in peace." He paused. "She asked me, before the adjournment, to tell you she is grateful. She said she would say it herself, but she was afraid she would not have the right words." Sienna smiled quietly. "She doesn't need to have the right words." "She said you would say something like that," he said, and something in his voice was so close to warm that she felt it physically, a kind of resonance in her sternum. She also said, and I am recounting this as delivered, that she thinks you and I are, and I am quoting directly, stupidly well suited to each other, and she hopes we figure that out before one of us does something foolish like walk away." Sienna looked at him. He was watching her with the kind of careful stillness that was. She had learned over 2 days how he held the things he cared most about. Not roughly, not carelessly, but with absolute precision, the way you held something you were afraid of damaging. "Myra said that," Sienna said. "Myra said that," he confirmed. "I am merely the messenger. And what does the messenger think?" His hands, those long-fingered, ring-bearing hands, rested on his knees. He looked at them for a moment. 412 years of absolute composure, and he looked at his own hands like a man who was not entirely certain what to do with the feeling currently occupying his chest. "I think," he said slowly, "that you walked into a confrontation with the sovereign king of the Veleth Court, and reversed his judgment in a storage room with a coffee pot still warm in your memory, and then you followed him underground into an immortal court and testified before a council of ancient vampires without losing a single thread of your own self in the process." He looked up at her. "And I think that I have not encountered anything like you in 412 years, and that is not a number I use carelessly." Sienna looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very formal declaration for a very narrow chair in an emptying court chamber." "I am a very formal person," he said, "but I mean it entirely. I know, she said. I can tell the difference between what you mean and what you're performing. You're not performing right now. No, he said, I am not. She reached across the small space between their chairs and put her hand over his. His hands were cool, as she had expected. He turned his palm up and let her hand rest there, and he looked at their joined hands with an expression of such careful, private wonder that she felt something inside her chest settle into a shape it had been looking for without knowing it. This is complicated, she said. Profoundly, he agreed. You're 412 years old and the sovereign of a vampire court. Yes, I'm 28 and I work the night shift at a diner. I am aware. That's a significant gap in several relevant categories. It is, he said. I will not pretend otherwise. But I am also, he said, someone who has just spent 2 days watching you navigate one of the most politically complicated proceedings in this court's recent history with more grace, intelligence, and genuine moral clarity than most council members manage in their first century. He closed his hand gently around hers, cool and precise and careful. The gap in categories does not diminish what I see when I look at you. What do you see? She asked. He met her eyes. Someone worth knowing, someone worth being honest with. Someone who makes this old, careful, sovereign part of me want to set down the performance of being untouchable and simply be present with another person. He paused. I do not have adequate words for how rare that is. Sienna turned her hand over and held his properly, fingers interlaced. He looked at the gesture as though it was something that mattered, because it was. I make no promises I can't keep, she said quietly. That's my own oldest rule. I know, he said. I would not ask you for any, but I'll say this much, she continued. I want to know you, the real version, not the sovereign version. I want to know what 400 years looks like from the inside, when you're not presiding over anything. I want to know what you care about when no one's watching. She met his silver eyes, the blue threads vivid in them now, alive. And if this goes where it might go, I want you to know that I am not someone who needs protection from the full weight of what that means. I can hold it. He looked at her for a moment of such profound, private feeling that even his extraordinary composure was barely sufficient to contain it. I know, he said. That is precisely why I am not afraid of this. She leaned forward, not far, just enough to close the last of the formal distance between them. He met her halfway, his free hand lifting, touching the side of her face with a gentleness so exact it made her breath still, as though he had calculated precisely how to hold something that mattered most carefully. It was not a kiss yet. It was the moment before the kiss. The moment where two people stood at the edge of something new and acknowledged it together, openly, without retreat. Then she tilted her face upward, and he tilted his downward, and the moment became the thing it had been becoming. His kiss was cool and deliberate and achingly careful, the kiss of someone who had all the time in the world and still treated the moment as though it was irreplaceable. Which it was. It was. Her free hand went to the front of his coat, and she held on to the dark fabric, not desperately, but certainly, the way you held on to something you intended to keep. When they drew back, his forehead rested against hers for a moment. His eyes were closed. She had never seen his eyes closed before, and the openness of it made something tighten in her throat. Complicated, she said softly. Yes, he said. His voice was lower than usual, a register she had not heard from him yet. But not wrong. No, he said, and opened his eyes. The silver and blue of them, this close, was extraordinary. Not wrong. The weeks after the trial moved differently than any weeks Sienna had previously experienced. She still worked her shifts at the Midnight Crescent diner. Because she had rent and principles and a genuine fondness for Pete the cook's inexplicable dedication to making the world's best hash browns, she maintained her life on the surface of the city in the daylight world, with its fluorescent lights and unreliable heat, and the couple at table 3, who now had the most aggressively ordinary problems she had ever been grateful for. But Aurelian was in her evenings, in the particular way that something that has shifted cannot be unshifted. He arrived at the diner exactly once in the weeks following the trial, at 11 in the evening, dressed in his dark coat, and sat at the counter and let her bring him coffee. He did not drink because vampires did not drink coffee, but he held the cup in both hands, and they talked across the counter for an hour, while Pete kept finding reasons to appear in the kitchen doorway and then disappear again, beaming.
"He likes you," Sienna told Aurelian. "He is terrified of me,"
Aurelian said. "He's both," she said. "It's a Pete specialty." Aurelian looked at the counter, at his untouched coffee, with a small, quiet smile that was still getting used to existing on his face. She was the primary reason it was getting the practice. He took her to the court's library on a Tuesday, a vast subterranean room with shelves that went up farther than a human library had any business going, filled with volumes that predated the printing press. He explained the history of the Veleth Court to her not as a briefing but as a conversation, responding to her questions with an attentiveness that made every answer feel like a gift he was presenting with both hands. She asked about the blood laws, about how they had changed over centuries, about whether any of them had ever been successfully challenged. He answered all of it. He asked her, in turn, about her own history, her childhood, the particular path that had led a woman with her qualities to a night shift diner, and he listened to the answers with his full attention in a way that made her feel genuinely, substantially, seen. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 19, and the 3 years after, during which Sienna had worked every job she could find to keep herself in one piece, and how she had wound up at the Midnight Crescent, more or less by accident, and discovered she was actually good at it, good at the relentlessness of the work and the constancy of the people, and the reliable daily requirement of showing up and being useful. She told him that the night she had let Mira in had not been remarkable to her, because remarkable kindness had not been the thing she intended. She had simply not been able to choose anything else. He listened to all of this without filling her pauses with his own words, which was, she thought, one of the most respectful things a person could do. "You have been very alone," he said when she had finished. "I've had people," she said. "Pete, a few friends. I'm not tragic." "I did not say tragic," he said. "I said alone. It is possible to have people in your life and still be fundamentally, quietly alone in the place where you keep your most essential self." He looked at his hands, the silver rings catching the library's warm light. "I know that particular geography extremely well." She looked at him. 400 years of being a king. 400 years of being the king, he said. The definite article makes a difference. There is very little room in the definite article for being simply a person who has questions and fears and preferences about what they want their days to look like. "What do you want your days to look like?" she asked. He considered this with the genuine seriousness of someone encountering the question for the first time in several decades. "Like this," he said finally. "Like a conversation in which I am not required to be correct, in which the other person is not managing me or afraid of me or trying to influence my judgment." He looked at her. "Like being with you." She reached across the table and took his hand, the way she had in the court chamber, fingers interlaced. He looked at it and held it with the same careful wonder as before. "Then let's make sure it looks like this," she said, regularly. He turned his hand and brought hers up and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, a gesture so formally tender that it rewired something fundamental in her chest. He looked at her over their joined hands with his silver and blue eyes and said, quietly, "Yes, let us do exactly that." 3 months later, the Veleth Court faced its next complication because courts of ancient vampires with political history going back centuries rarely ran out of complications. A rival court, the Cerethian Lodge, sent a formal delegation to dispute the Veleth Court's claim over 3 long-contested territories in the underground city network below the business district. The delegation's leader was a vampire named Countess Davarine, tall and imperious, and carrying the elegant menace of someone who had survived her particular century. Through a combination of intelligence and willingness to make very hard choices, she arrived in the Veleth Court, expecting a negotiation. She arrived and found Sienna seated at Aurelian's right hand at the council table, which was not a position anyone had expected a human to occupy, and which said something the Veleth Court had been still absorbing about the precise nature of its king's current priorities. Davarine looked at Sienna for a long moment. Then she looked at Aurelian. "You have brought a human to a territorial negotiation. I have brought a person whose judgment I trust implicitly to a conversation in which I intend to reach an equitable resolution," Aurelian said. "Her humanity is a characteristic, not a credential. If you would like to proceed, I suggest we begin with the Carathis district boundary, which is where the most significant disagreement lies. Davarine absorbed this. She looked at Sienna again. Sienna met her gaze directly. "You are the waitress," Davarine said, in a tone that was not entirely readable. "I am," Sienna said. "Sienna Castell, it's a pleasure to meet you, Countess." Davarine's expression shifted through several configurations before arriving at something unexpected. The faintest edge of amusement. "The king of the Veleth Court has introduced you to his court and his table," she said. "That is a declaration that carries weight or traditions. I'm aware of what it means," Sienna said. "He explained it to me. I agreed to it deliberately." Davarine looked at Aurelian. "I begin to understand why Valdros's plan failed," she said. "You have made an unusual choice, Belisar." "I have made an entirely logical one," Aurelian said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was not just sovereign confidence. It was the particular conviction of someone speaking about something they had decided completely and had no intention of revisiting. Davarine's territorial negotiation lasted 4 hours. It resolved in a way that satisfied both courts, largely because Sienna, who had no ancestral grudge or territorial pride, invested in any of the geography in question, was able to ask the clarifying questions that neither side had been willing to ask for fear of appearing weak, and the answers to those questions turned out to make the areas of genuine disagreement significantly smaller than the areas of assumed disagreement. Davarine left the Veleth Court having conceded slightly less than she might have, and having gained somewhat more, and she told Aurelian on her way out that his human was either a diplomat in disguise or an honest person, and in her experience the two were difficult to come by in either category. Aurelian relayed this to Sienna afterward. Sienna said, "I'll take it." She also said, he continued, leaning against the council table with his arms crossed. Something he rarely did but which she had noticed was how he stood when he was privately content. "That she hopes I have the sense to keep you." Sienna looked at him. He looked back at her. "Do you," she asked, "have the sense?" He uncrossed his arms and came toward her, unhurried, certain. He took her face in both his hands, those long, cool fingers, and looked at her from a distance of very little. "I have," he said, "spent 412 years being sensible about everything, and I intend to spend whatever comes next being sensible about this. Yes, I intend to keep you, if keeping you means something we can both agree to." "Keeping me is a two-way agreement," she said. "I'm keeping you back." He smiled, a full smile, not the shadow of one, not the edge of one, the actual thing, and it was devastating in the best way. Warm and genuine, and remaking his face entirely into something more than the sovereign mask. She had the sense of a door that had been held shut for an enormously long time opening at last. He kissed her, there in the council chamber, with both hands cupping her face and complete unhurried intention. And she held the front of his coat and kissed him back with the same certainty, and the ancient stone walls of the Veleth Court, which had witnessed 4 centuries of politics and power and ancient pride, witnessed this as well and did not find it unworthy. The months that followed were full, in a way Sienna's life had not been before. Not overwhelming, not destabilizing, but genuinely, substantively full. She continued her work at the diner, partly because she liked it, and partly because she was not someone who reshaped her life to fit someone else's expectations, even when that someone else was a vampire king. Aurelian did not ask her to. He came to the diner sometimes in the late evenings, and he sat at the counter with his untouched coffee and his quiet presence. And Pete eventually stopped dropping things when he saw him and graduated to leaving him impractical food offerings that Aurelian acknowledged with a grave and genuine courtesy that Pete found deeply satisfying. She went to the court regularly, officially recognized as a representative of no category that existed in the court's long tradition, which Countess Veolara had resolved by inventing a new one with a kind of calm institutional authority that made new categories feel like they had always been necessary. She attended negotiations and council discussions, not always as a speaker, sometimes simply as a presence. She learned the court's history and its law and its internal politics with the attentiveness she brought to everything. And the council members who had initially regarded her with skepticism gradually, individually, and somewhat against their own inclinations, found that her presence improved the quality of the room's reasoning. Casimir, who had been Aurelian's first and most trusted guard for 60 years, told her 3 months in that she was the best thing that had happened to the court since the establishment of its current charter, and he said it with such stern sincerity that she genuinely did not know whether to laugh or feel moved, and ended up doing both. Leodas, who had started everything by calling her the waitress in the street, became a genuine friend. He had the quality she valued most in people, which was the willingness to be curious without being afraid of the answers. They talked often, in the gaps of the court's days, about what the world looked like from both sides of the divide between human and vampire. And those conversations were some of the most interesting she had ever had. Mira Voss sent a letter, 6 months after the trial, from somewhere she declined to name specifically, saying that she was well and building something new, and that she heard the court was in a significantly improved state, and she attributed approximately 40% of this to Sienna and the rest to Aurelian, finally having someone who made him laugh. Sienna read this to Aurelian in the court library, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said quietly, "She is not wrong," and the way he said it made the tightness come back in Sienna's throat, but the good kind, the kind that came with warmth. There came a night, 8 months after the diner, when they were in the library late, both of them reading, which had become one of the most comfortable shapes their time together could take, the companionable quality of two people engaged in their own thinking, while also being near each other, when Aurelian set his book down and looked at her. She looked up from her own book. The library was very quiet. The candlelight was warm. "I would like to talk about the future," he said. "Okay," she said, and set her book down as well. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing his words carefully, not because he was uncertain of what he felt, but because he wanted to honor the feeling with the precision it deserved. "You are human," he said. "I am not. This is a fact with consequences that I have thought about considerably over these 8 months. There are options within the immortal order that address this gap, and I have not raised them because I did not want to imply that your humanity is something I need you to resolve in order to be fully present to what we are to each other. It is not. I want to be unambiguous about that first." "I know," she said. "I know that. Thank you for saying it anyway. But I also know," he continued, "that you are someone who thinks carefully about consequences and who does not appreciate having logical realities omitted from conversations simply because they are complicated. So I want to be complete with you." "Always," she said. He met her eyes. "There is a process within our tradition, ancient and significant. It is called the Covenant of Shared Night. It is not a conversion. It is more accurate to call it an intertwining, a binding of one life's essence to another's across the divide between mortal and immortal. It does not erase what you are. You would remain yourself in every meaningful way, but it would extend your span significantly, and it would create a bond between us that has formal standing in the blood law and the court's tradition. It is the deepest commitment my kind can make, and it requires full and entirely voluntary choice from both parties, with complete understanding of what it means. There is no coercion possible in its structure. It would not work if either party was uncertain." Sienna was quiet, looking at him, processing. He waited. He did not fill the silence, which she appreciated. "What does significantly mean?" she asked. "Your lifespan would become effectively aligned with mine," he said. "You would not be immortal in the absolute sense, but you would age at a rate that made centuries possible rather than decades." She let this sit. She looked at the library around them, at the shelves full of centuries, at the man across the table who had been alive for 4 of those centuries and who had spent 8 months of them becoming the most important person in her particular world. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "If I said no, if I said I want to stay human, full span, whatever that means for the timeline between us, what would you do?" He did not hesitate. "I would be with you for every year you had," he said, "and I would grieve you when it ended, and it would be worth every part of that." She looked at him for a long moment, at the absolute sincerity of his silver and blue eyes, at the certainty and the pain both present in the same expression, at the man who had decided completely, who had chosen without conditions. "That's what I needed to know," she said softly. "Yes, because I needed to know it wasn't about the timeline for you," she said. "I needed to know you weren't offering me the covenant because you wanted to keep me longer. I needed to know you were with me regardless." "I am," he said, entirely and regardless. She reached across the library table and took his hand. Familiar now, this gesture, worn smooth by months of use, and still somehow new every time, he held it with the same precision as the first time. "Tell me everything about it," she said. "The covenant, everything. I want to understand it completely before I decide anything." "Of course," he said, and he told her thoroughly and honestly every element, every consequence, every dimension of what it was and what it meant and what it required. He told her for a long time until the library's candles had burned to different lengths and the quiet had deepened around them, and she had asked every question she could think to ask, and he had answered all of them without simplifying anything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to." He went very still. "Not because I'm afraid of the timeline," she said, "and not to make things easier for either of us in the court tradition, though that's a reasonable practical benefit. I want to because I love you, because I have been in love with you since approximately the moment you smiled at me for real in the council chamber, and I have been waiting for the right time to say that directly without dressing it in something more manageable." She looked at him steadily, the way she did everything. "I love you, Aurelian, and I want the centuries, not for the length of them, for the content of them, for the library evenings and the terrible court politics, and the hash-brown offerings from Pete and whatever comes after all of that. I want it because it is with you." He looked at her face for a long, reverent moment. His hand around hers had gone completely still, as though he was afraid movement would disturb the reality of what she had just said. Then he said very quietly, "I love you, Sienna. I have loved you since a storage room at 2 a.m, when you looked at the sovereign king of the Veleth Court and told him he might be working from bad information." The corner of his mouth moved, the shadow smile that had been practicing becoming the real thing. "No one has ever said anything to me that mattered more than that, because it was honest, and because it was you." She stood from her chair and came around the table, and he stood as well, and she put both arms around him, and he put both arms around her, carefully and then not carefully, with the kind of warmth that did not need to perform itself. That was simply its own fact in the space between two people. He held her with the full force of a 400-year-old heart that had finally found the thing it had been too proud to admit it was looking for. She held him with the full force of someone who had learned, through loss and solitude and the relentless daily work of being a person, that love was not a complication to be managed. It was the point. The covenant of shared night was performed 1 month later in the court's oldest chamber, the one below even the main court level, where the stone was pre-medieval and the air was very still. Countess Velara presided. Casimir and Leodis witnessed. The process was quiet and profound and involved words in a language older than English and a binding of light, silver and warm gold intertwined that rose between them and then settled and became invisible, not gone, simply present, as fundamental things became when they stopped needing to announce themselves. Sienna held Aurelian's hands through it and looked at his face, and felt the covenant seal with a sensation that was not dramatic, not painful, not strange. It felt like something completing, like a sentence that had been reaching for its ending and had finally arrived. Afterward, Countess Velara said, in her precise and architectural voice, "This court formally recognizes this bond and its standing within the blood law. May it endure with honor." Lauders, who had been doing extremely well, made a small sound in the back of his throat that he immediately controlled. Casimir looked straight ahead with the expression of one who was absolutely not moved at all. Aurelian looked at Sienna in the old, still chamber, with the candlelight and the stone, and the weight of all those centuries around them both. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She laughed, bright and genuine, and entirely herself, echoing slightly in the old stone, and it was the most alive sound that chamber had heard in a very long time. He smiled at her, the full and devastating smile, and drew her into his arms and held her close, and pressed his mouth to her hair, and breathed in the fact of her. Outside, above the court, the city was doing what cities did at any given hour of any given day. Moving and thrumming and full of ordinary lives going about their ordinary business, full of fluorescent lights, coffee pots, and night shifts and couples at table 3. Above it all, somewhere, the sun was finishing its arc across a sky, Aurelian would never see directly, but which Sienna could describe to him in terms precise and affectionate enough that it almost felt like his. She had promised, one evening, to describe every sunrise she ever saw to him in enough detail that he could hold the image himself. He had held her hand and said, that sounded like an arrangement he could commit to. She had said it was only fair, because he spent every night describing history she would never witness in person, and she found it the best listening she had ever done. They had been building it together since then, this archive, this library of traded perception, the sunrises she gave him, and the centuries he gave her. The present and the past held carefully between two people who had found each other at 2 a.m. in a storage room during the worst kind of confrontation, and had, against every expectation, been exactly what the other one needed. It was not a small life, it was not a simple one. A human woman and a vampire king at the complicated, beautiful intersection of two worlds, navigating courts and politics and ancient law and the daily, necessary, irreplaceable work of choosing each other. But it was theirs, and in the Veleth Court, in the city built above and below at once, in the long evenings of the library and the quiet mornings of the apartment with the factory windows, in every shift at the midnight crescent and every council session and every conversation that went later than planned, because neither of them wanted to stop talking, in all of it, and through all of it, it was genuinely, fully, and without reservation theirs. Sienna Castell, who had only ever promised to be honest and decent and present to the people who needed her, had been all three in a storage room, at the right moment for the right person. And Aurelian Belisar, who had spent 412 years being the sovereign king of everything and the genuine keeper of almost nothing, had arrived to render a judgment and had, instead, received, from a woman in a blue apron with a coffee pot still warm in her memory, the most extraordinary thing his centuries had ever produced. A reason to set the crown down and simply be. They were both, thoroughly and irrevocably, home.